All right, let's continue this conversation further. Joining us now from Delaware is Krish O'Mara Vignarajah, who is the president and CEO of Global Refuge. Her group is a faith-based nonprofit that helps refugees and immigrants find a new home in the U.S. She also served in the Obama White House and the State Department. Krish O'Mara, welcome. Good to have you today.
Thanks for having me.
Let's just start with this executive order as we understand it. Obviously, we're still waiting for the official details, but as far as we understand it, what are your thoughts so far?
Well, I think it's important to understand the context. The Biden administration is clearly hamstrung by congressional leaders who refuse to acknowledge that secure borders and robust humanitarian protections are not mutually exclusive concepts. The fact is we can and should do both. Unfortunately, our immigration policies haven't been updated in any meaningful way since the 1990s, and both efforts to pass bipartisan legislation in the past 6 months have been torpedoed by partisan politics. And that inaction is unacceptable. I think that's why we're seeing so many people come to the southern border because other pathways have been so backlogged. And that's also why we've seen President Biden forced to essentially legislate by executive order, which is wholly unsustainable.
So both political sides seem to appreciate this is an issue the American public cares a lot about. You see it in poll after poll after poll, but it's how to address this issue where you see the division. What do you think would be a more effective fix for the Biden administration?
I think this is where the administration needs to get back to an approach that balances the carrot and stick. That's what the vast majority of Americans want. Poll after poll show that they support a policy framework that ensures a secure, orderly border and robust humanitarian protections that align with our core values. I think the problem with this executive order is it's purely stick. And so that's where I think focusing solely on administrative actions that curtail asylum rights is problematic. The Biden administration, I think, instead should look to implement a holistic policy to manage our southern border, which includes increasing legal pathways such as guest worker and family reunification programs, building up the safe mobility offices in the Western Hemisphere. Those would allow migrants to apply from abroad. And of course, we also need to really kind of cut down on trafficking operations.
But Krish O'Mara, let me play devil's advocate for just a moment. For the politicians who say that there needs to be something in place that deters people from coming to the southern border, that there are systems in place to allow for legal migration, but there has to be a system in place to deter some of these folks from coming here. What would you say to those people?
I'd say, look, there is more that unites us than divides us if we can actually try to legislate and solve this problem. Our view is we are a sovereign nation and we need to be able to manage our borders. But at the same time, organizations like Global Refuge, who work with vulnerable asylum seekers, we don't want migrants trying to game the asylum system. But this executive order really does raise a number of concerns. One is the legality. As you just heard earlier, the Trump administration tried to invoke this same authority to shut down access to asylum, and that was ultimately blocked by the federal courts. And I think this is where we have serious concerns about the implications of this strategy. It doesn't recognize some of the clients that we work with who are fleeing the most dire of circumstances, and they have a legal right to exercise their opportunity to seek asylum. And then I guess just the final point I'd make to those politicians is we know that Trump-era policies that are these hardline restrictions don't actually deter people from crossing the border. In fact, we saw crossings increase when these types of policies have been implemented in the past.
Let me ask you lastly, both political parties I'm sure, work with people like yourself who are close to the issue, who boots on the ground really understand the issue day in and day out. And yet, as you have pointed out, there hasn't been significant immigration reform since the early 90s. How do you explain that to people who may be watching thinking, how is that possible? Both sides understand the issue. Both sides work with people who understand the issue. And yet, nothing seems to happen significantly.
It's a great question because I think it explains how many days I feel like I'm just hitting my head against a wall. We don't have a policy problem. We have a politics problem. And I think understanding that, one side has made this a wedge issue, the other side has viewed this as their Achilles heel, and so they haven't wanted to talk about it, has led to this dynamics where people want to score political points on the backs of some of the most vulnerable children and families who are seeking refuge in the U.S. And so what I try to explain is as a nation of immigrants, where it is in our economic interests, it's in our national security interests, it is the right thing and the smart thing to do, there is an opportunity to course correct, because we have the lowest birth rate since the census has been tracking this issue. We need immigration. That is the only way we keep Medicare and Social Security afloat. It's the only way we keep food on our table. It's how we address inflation. And so I think this is where the American public needs to speak to our politicians and say, lead. Don't grandstand, don't fearmonger, but actually fix this problem.
We will wait to hear, of course, the details of this. But Krish O'Mara Vignarajah, great to have your insights today and your perspective. Thank you. She is the CEO of Global Refuge.
Thanks for having me.